Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Wolf. I'm an Associate Director in our Academic and Membership Affairs Department. This presentation will provide you an overview of the Division II review of issues related to name, image, and likeness. A brief overview of the course of this presentation. We're going to start with the background of the review, how we got to this point today, and then we're going to move into the name, image, and likeness concepts under consideration. You'll see those fall under two categories right now, student athlete, athletically related business activities, and then the use of name, image, and likeness to promote or endorse a third-party commercial product. We'll then segue into some additional considerations, including use of institutional marks, reporting requirements, and use of professional services. And then we'll wrap up by talking about the next steps in this review. So for a bit of background, the NCAA Division II Administrative Committee charged the Division II Legislation Committee with this review. Given that that committee has oversight of most elements of the NCAA rules manual, the Legislation Committee was seen to be the most appropriate group to lead this discussion. However, there was an acknowledgement that there weren't necessarily all the necessary voices around that table. So additional individuals, including athletic directors from the Division II Athletics Directors Association Board, coaches, and additional student athletes from our national SAC were added to the March 2020 Legislation Committee meeting to provide their input as part of the review. Coming out of that meeting, the committee supported a number of concepts that would permit Division II student athletes to benefit from the use of their name, image, and likeness, consistent with the principles and guidelines given by the NCAA Board of Directors in October of 2019. In addition to these concepts, the committees discussed potential reporting requirements for such activities, as well as the use of professional services to set forward parameters for these NIL activities. We'll now move into the NIL concepts under consideration. The first bucket, as mentioned, deals with student athlete athletically related business activities. The first concept deals with student athlete work product. Under current legislation, student athletes are permitted to use their name, image, and likeness to promote non-athletically related work product as long as no reference is made to their participation in college athletics. So for example, a student athlete who is a musician can sell their music on iTunes, or if they write a book, that book can be sold on Amazon, again, provided it's not tied to their athletic status. But student athletes are not permitted to use their name, image, or likeness to promote athletically related work product under current legislation. The potential change here put forward by the committee would be to adopt legislation to permit student athletes to use their name, image, and likeness to promote their own athletically related work product. So a couple of examples here could include a student athlete coming up with their own apparel company that sells athletics apparel. Maybe they come up with a new piece of athletics equipment particular to their sport. Or potentially they write a book about the impact of athletics on their life, a memoir type book, as opposed to a novel. So you'll see throughout this presentation these issue questions here for you to be thinking about as you develop your own opinion on these concepts. At the end of this presentation, we'll discuss a quick survey we're going to send out to the membership as well, where you'll have an opportunity to provide feedback on these issues. In terms of rationale, the committee noted that allowing a student athlete to use their name, image, and likeness to promote any work product they come up with is consistent with the Division II philosophy of life in the balance. We want our student athletes to pursue any entrepreneurial adventures that they may come up with, just as their non-athlete peers are able to do without restriction. Additionally, many of your institutions are establishing entrepreneurship programs. So it's an academic course of study, and in some instances, our student athletes are prohibited from doing the things they need for their classwork because of NCAA legislation. So the committee really felt like it was important that student athletes be able to choose their academic path without impact from our NCAA rules. The next concept deals with fee for lessons and camps and clinics. So current legislation allows student athletes to be paid to teach private lessons, but they're not permitted to promote the availability of those lessons. So it has to be a situation where an individual in the local community comes up to a student athlete, maybe it's a tennis player, they know they're a member of your institution's tennis team, and asks to teach their son or daughter private lessons. That can happen, but again, it has to be paid the going rate and has to, again, not be advertised by the student athlete in terms of its availability. Because of the restriction on advertising, student athletes are also currently precluded from conducting their own camps or clinics. In terms of a possible change, the committee discussed potentially adopting legislation to permit student athletes to promote the availability of private lessons, as well as operate their own camps and clinics. The caveat here would be if institutional facilities are used for either of these things, a student athlete would need to follow applicable institutional process for renting institutional facility space in a manner consistent with the general public. So if your institution charges a particular fee to rent those tennis courts and perhaps requires a certain level of insurance coverage, a student athlete would need to go through that normal process. In terms of rationale, the committee noted that permitting student athletes to promote the availability of private lessons and allowing them to run their own camps and clinics will provide an additional employment opportunity for our student athletes. Our student athletes certainly are subject matter experts in their sports, and they should be able to profit off of that by teaching others what they know about their sport to the general public and beyond. The next concept deals with modeling non-institutional athletics apparel and equipment. Current legislation allows our student athletes to model non-athletically related apparel, but they're not permitted to model athletics apparel or equipment, regardless of sport. The committee discussed a legislative change to allow student athletes to model non-institutional athletics apparel and equipment. The rationale for this concept would be that student athletes being permitted to model any apparel or equipment will allow them to take advantage of any modeling opportunity that they may be offered without any concern for potential eligibility impact. This also may help our compliance administrators by reducing the monitoring burden on their end. It would eliminate the need to educate student athletes regarding potential modeling opportunities, and it would also reduce the need for the analysis of whether or not something actually has an athletics tie. So certain modeling opportunities right now are very clear-cut, would not be permissible for a student athlete to model for a specifics apparel company. But what if they want to model for a general department store, and in that catalog, for example, they model athletics apparel in addition to non-athletics apparel? Some of those situations right now can be really challenging for our compliance administrators, and just allowing them to model any type of apparel or equipment would alleviate that consternation. The next concept deals with crowdfunding for items of need. Under current legislation, institutions are permitted to organize fundraisers for student athletes or their family members in the instance of a catastrophic or extreme event beyond their control. Examples of this would include a house fire or a catastrophic injury that results in incredible medical bills. Our legislation also allows student athletes to raise funds to participate as a member of an outside team. So they can use crowdfunding in that manner to perhaps participate in an Athletes in Action tour in the summer. But it's not permissible for our student athletes to raise money through crowdfunding or otherwise for general items of need, such as tuition or a laptop. The committee talked at length about the permissible usage of crowdfunding for student athletes and what was appropriate and not for student athletes to raise money for. The committee's potential recommendation is to allow student athletes and their family members to organize fundraisers for student athletes or their family members in those extreme circumstances beyond control of the student athlete, similar to what the institution can also provide. The rationale here is really to cut out some of the red tape that currently exists in the legislation. So again, as was noted previously, institutions are allowed to set up these fundraisers when those catastrophic events happen. But oftentimes, a student athlete's friends or family members are the first ones to know of the situation, and obviously many of them want to do things to help. And so allowing this to happen without institutional organization of it would allow for that immediate assistance in urgent circumstances without those unnecessary steps of the institution being involved. The committee decided that it was likely still appropriate to maintain the current parameters, including the proceeds have to be designated for a specific purpose, receipts have to be kept on file, and excess proceeds must be given to a nonprofit organization to ensure that there are appropriate protections to limit abuse of the legislation. The committee, again, talked at length about what other things may be appropriate to allow student athletes to crowdfund for, and they ultimately landed in a place that they did not feel like it was appropriate for student athletes to be able to otherwise fundraise for items of need, so the aforementioned tuition, laptops, due to concerns about the potential impact on our financial aid limitations and the potential circumventing that, and certainly the potential for improper recruiting inducements. Of course, there's a monitoring concern here, of course, of knowing what is truly an item of need. So that was why it felt appropriate for the committee to suggest that it just should expand the current legislation as opposed to adding additional opportunities for student athletes to fundraise. The next concept deals with sale of memorabilia. Current legislation allows student athletes to retain athletics apparel and used equipment at the end of their collegiate participation, but it is not permissible to sell those items prior to exhausting eligibility. Additionally, student athletes are not currently permitted to contribute toward the purchase of an award, even if the value of the award remains within our specified value limits in Bylaw 16. The committee discussed relaxing these restrictions to permit student athletes to sell athletics apparel and used equipment, as well as awards provided by the institution. Institutions would still be responsible for educating student athletes on which apparel or equipment items would be expected to be retained for institutional events, such as team travel and promotional activities. So, for example, if your institution provides every student athlete at the beginning of the year with a polo shirt with the expectation that those be worn during community engagement events, the student athlete would not be permitted to sell that item until you as an institution have given the blessing to say that item is no longer needed for institutional events. In terms of rationale, the committee noted that permitting student athletes to sell items provided to the institution treats them as a regular student. So certainly a student athlete may receive more from the institution than a non-athlete peer would in terms of gear or equipment and awards, but it is ultimately their personal property once given to them, and again, once there's no longer an expectation that they use it for institutional events. So there's really an opportunity here in the committee's mind to streamline that approach. Additionally, it was noted this is another opportunity to potentially reduce the monitoring burden for our compliance administrators, as it would eliminate the need to track on these items while the student athlete has remaining eligibility to ensure that they are not being sold currently. We'll now move into the second category of name, image, and likeness concepts. These deal with use of a student athlete's name, image, and likeness to promote or endorse a third-party commercial product. The first concept deals with a commercial business promoting student athlete attendance at institutional fundraisers. Current legislation allows an institution, conference, or nonprofit charitable agency to use a student athlete's name, image, or likeness for promotional activities. Many of your institutions conduct fundraisers at local commercial businesses, whereby maybe the business is going to give your institution a cut of the profits from that evening's event. In those instances, the commercial establishment may not advertise the presence of student athletes at the activity. The institution is able to promote that. Student athletes on their own can promote the activity, but the commercial business is not able to promote the activity or presence of student athletes at the event. The committee discussed potentially allowing a commercial business to advertise the presence of student athletes at the establishment for an institutional fundraiser. The committee's rationale here was allowing this to take place in terms of commercial businesses promoting student athlete attendance at institutional fundraisers will provide additional opportunities for awareness of these events. Again, if the commercial business is ultimately going to give the athletics department a cut of the profit, the more people who know about the event, arguably, the more successful that event will be for the athletic department. It will also reduce the monitoring burden, as it will eliminate the need to educate those commercial businesses on the current legislation. So right now, your compliance administrators are having to likely send educational material to these commercial businesses to remind them that they cannot promote the fact that student athletes will be in attendance. This change would eliminate the need to do that. The next concept deals with monetized media platforms unrelated to athletics. It's a fancy way for thinking about your social media influencers, your individuals on Instagram or YouTube or any other social media site you may be thinking of. Current legislation does not allow student athletes to use their name, image, and likeness to promote a commercial product if any references are made to their involvement in intercollegiate athletics. The committee discussed adopting legislation to permit student athletes to establish one of these monetized media platforms unrelated to athletics. So a lot of times what these social media influencers receive in some instances is actual cash, but other times it's products from whatever entity they may be promoting. And the committee felt like either one of those arrangements would be appropriate. The committee noted that institutional code of conduct policies could govern whether there are any restrictions on the types of products a student athlete could promote. So for instance, maybe an institution is not comfortable with a student athlete promoting a product related to alcohol or sports wagering. That could ultimately be an institutional determination. As technology continues to evolve, we know opportunities for our student athletes and non-student athletes alike to use social media to market themselves and create a revenue stream will increase. Division II institutions, candidly, do not have the resources, even currently, to monitor institutional student athlete social media accounts, especially when student athletes may have multiple accounts across various platforms. And certainly, as all of you know, social media is ever evolving. So even if you have the capacity to check a student athlete's account in the morning, doesn't mean that there's not something impermissible there in the afternoon. The next concept deals with endorsement of a third-party product or service more generally. So we just talked about the social media aspect, but think of these as any commercial endorsements on any platform. So again, current legislation restricts student athletes from using their name, image, or likeness to promote a commercial product if there's any reference made to their involvement in college sports. The possible change here discussed by the committee would be to permit student athletes to promote third-party products and services, regardless of whether they're athletically related, and include their student athlete status in such promotions. The committee acknowledged that most Division II student athletes will have limited opportunities in their lifetime to make money on their name, image, and likeness as a result of their athletics ability. As you know, most of our student athletes will go off and seek other opportunities that aren't necessarily tied to their athletics ability after graduation. So the opportunity for them to maximize their ability to endorse a commercial product tied to their athletics ability really may be during those 4 or 5 years where they are at a Division II institution. The committee also noted, though, that it was really important that our student athletes remain students if this is permissible ultimately, and thus a student athlete should not be permitted to miss class to participate in any activities related to promoting a third-party commercial product or service. You'll note this recommendation is similar to the current legislation that exists regarding promotional activities, which also does not allow our student athletes to miss class. The next concept deals with autographs. Current legislation does not permit a student athlete to be paid for their autograph. The committee had very robust conversations about autographs and whether or not student athletes should be permitted to be paid for their autograph. They ultimately landed that student athletes should not be able to be paid just for their autograph. The committee's rationale really focused on the Division II philosophy of community engagement activities. There was noted concern that student athletes regularly participate in post-game opportunities of autograph sessions or general community engagement activities whereby an individual may come up and ask for a student athlete's autograph, and that is just part of the fabric of the division. There was concern that if we allow student athletes to be paid for their autograph, this may ultimately impact the high value we put on community engagement as a division and put those opportunities at risk. The next concept deals with appearances. Similar to previous concepts, as you know, student athletes are not permitted to be paid for using their name, image, and likeness to promote a commercial product or service, including receiving payment to just appear at a commercial business. Student athletes are permitted to receive actual necessary expenses, such as transportation or meals, associated with appearances at institutional, charitable, educational, or nonprofit fundraisers based on the current promotional activities legislation. The potential legislative change here would be to permit student athletes to be paid for appearances at commercial businesses and/or at charitable, educational, or nonprofit agencies. In terms of rationale, largely similar to the endorsement concept presented earlier. The committee noted, again, that most Division II student athletes are going to have limited opportunities in their lifetime to make money using their name, image, and likeness tied to their athletics ability. The committee felt like ultimately this is something that really should be market driven. If a market exists for a Division II student athlete to be paid for an appearance, they should be permitted to capitalize on that, as long as there's appropriate regulation to ensure that this is not ultimately used as a recruiting inducement opportunity to attend a particular institution. Additionally, it was noted by the committee, as was discussed earlier as well, that institutions can use student athlete appearances to raise money for the institution. So allowing student athletes to be paid for their own appearances also seemed fair. Similar to the endorsement concept, the committee does recommend that if a student athlete is able to be paid for appearances, that they should not be permitted to miss class to participate in any such activities. The final concept deals with licensing of a student athlete's name, image, or likeness unrelated to work product. Again, current legislation restricts student athletes from using their name, image, or likeness to promote a commercial product or service. The committee discussed a possible legislative change to permit student athletes to license their name, image, or likeness for commercial products unrelated to their work product. So these would be things where another entity is seeking to use that student athlete's name, image, or likeness on products they are producing, as opposed to something a student athlete is actively doing. Very similar to how your institutions license out your trademarked name or logos on other commercial products. Similar rationale here again, noting that Division II student athletes will likely have limited opportunities in their lifetime to make money in this manner as a result of their athletics ability. The committee noted that if a student athlete becomes well known for a particular nickname or their particular likeness, allowing that student athlete to license that should be permissible as a revenue stream for that individual. Now that we've walked through the name, image, and likeness concepts, we'll shift to discussing the additional considerations in terms of the framework around these concepts. The first consideration deals with the use of institutional marks. Under current legislation, student athletes are permitted to use their name, image, and likeness to promote those non-athletically related work products mentioned earlier, such as music or a novel, provided no reference is made to their participation in college athletics. As a result of that, it's not permissible for a student athlete to use institutional marks in such promotions. The committee discussed whether to permit student athletes to use institutional marks, such as your institutional logo or a particular slogan, provided approval is obtained through your established institutional process for licensing in a manner consistent with the general public. So for example, if your institution requires a potential licensee to pay an annual fee, and then your institution receives a certain percentage of royalties, student athletes would need to go through that same process. The committee has a fair amount to still discuss in this area, though, and they would like certainly membership feedback on this issue. So first, is the membership supportive of allowing student athletes to use those institutional marks, provided they go through the normal institutional process? And are there any instances in which a student athlete should not be permitted to use institutional marks, even if the general public would otherwise be able to use them in that manner? The committee's conversation really focused on the fact that, again, any member of the general public, in theory, can use institutional marks provided they go through that established process. So it was important in the committee's conversation that a student athlete not be given any special access above what a member of a general public would receive, but being a student athlete on its own should not preclude them from using those institutional marks. It was, of course, noted, as is true with any potential licensee, that institutions would have the discretion to determine whether to license their marks for each individual student athlete's application. The next consideration deals with reporting requirements. The current Division II employment legislation permits student athletes to be employed provided the student athlete is paid only for work performed, they're paid at the going rate, and that payment is not on the basis of the student athlete's athletics reputation. The committee certainly noted that everything related to name, image, and likeness and all the concepts that we've walked through so far today will necessitate eliminating the prong that pay not be on the basis of a student athlete's athletics reputation. Inherently, anything tied to a student athlete's use of their name, image, and likeness will in some way be tied to their athletics reputation. However, the committee really did note that it's important that the institutions be aware of these activities where student athletes are being paid for use of their name, image, and likeness, and to ensure that that payment is consistent with the principles and guidelines put forward by the Board of Governors. The committee is seeking the membership's feedback on what is appropriate in terms of reporting requirements. Should student athletes be required to report all activities in which they are using their name, image, and likeness to the institution, or are we only concerned about certain activities? If certain activities, which ones rise to the level of a need to be reported to the institution and to be monitored? The committee noted that, again, inherently any use of a student athlete's name, image, or likeness that for an activity that has an athletics nexus will result in a student athlete being paid, at least in part, as a result of their athletics reputation. So we really will ultimately need to modernize the employment legislation in this way, but we can still have, of course, very reasonable dialogue on what is appropriate for reporting requirements and what would ensure transparency without adding additional burden to our compliance administrators and athletics departments. The final two concepts deal with use of professional services. We'll start by talking about use of professional services prior to initial full-time enrollment at a Division II institution. Under current legislation, an individual is ineligible for participation in college athletics if they enter into an agreement with or receive benefits from an agent. This is the only pre-enrollment amateurism rule in the division. So everything we've discussed related to the use of name, image, and likeness previously, a prospective student athlete can engage in those activities without impacting their amateur status to become a Division II student athlete. Additionally, Division II allows former professional student athletes to participate in Division II athletics, provided they are no longer under contract with the professional team. You'll see here the definition of an agent per our Division II legislation, and it is fairly wide in scope. There's a large umbrella there, and a lot of the conversation that the legislation committee talked about was whether this is an appropriate definition of an agent, knowing where we are now in 2020. So the committee discussed changing the pre-enrollment amateurism legislation to permit individuals who have previously entered into an agreement with or received benefits from an agent to retain their amateur status, provided the arrangement with that individual ends once the prospective student athlete triggers full-time collegiate enrollment. Few points of rationale here for why the committee has this particular recommendation. First, as was noted, the current definition of an agent is quite broad, and that can make it challenging to educate prospective student athletes and coaches on what actions trigger agent status. Removing the prohibition on entering into an agreement with or receiving benefits from an agent prior to initial full-time enrollment would eliminate confusion and potentially negative eligibility impacts. Prospective student athletes, because of confusion on the definition of an agent, do not always report their interactions with certain individuals, as they may be unclear that those individuals have triggered the definition of an agent under NCA rules. When the enforcement staff sees these violations, oftentimes contests have already been played, resulting in inadvertent violations. In more extreme instances, we see nullification of contests and potentially vacated championships. We also noted that if a Division II student athlete could previously have been a professional athlete, it may be unrealistic to think that those individuals could have been a professional athlete without having used the service of an agent to help them navigate that landscape. Moving to use of professional services following initial full-time enrollment, a student athlete jeopardizes their amateur status as soon as they enter into an agreement with or receive benefits from an agent. So they no longer, as of that moment, can participate in Division II athletics. The committee discussed revising the definition of an agent to specify that for Division II purposes, an agent is an individual who markets a student athlete's athletics ability or reputation with a professional sports team for purposes of obtaining a professional sports contract. Similar to the conversation about pre-enrollment, the post-enrollment conversation also centered on the fact that the current definition of an agent is very far-reaching, especially given the range of professional services that a student athlete may need to engage in activities related to their name, image, and likeness. Many of these activities certainly will require a student athlete to secure professional services, such as a tax advisor or a business agent, to help them navigate a complex business environment and ultimately be successful in these endeavors. So the committee is interested in membership feedback on whether this more narrowly tailored definition is appropriate to allow student athletes to engage in these activities related to name, image, and likeness without, again, having the agent tie to truly promoting the student athlete's athletics ability. With that, we'll transition to an overview of the next steps in this review. The committee is seeking feedback on all of these concepts and additional considerations and requests membership input through mid-June. This feedback will help the committee put together legislative recommendations at their meeting June 22nd and 23rd. Any legislative recommendations put forward by the Legislation Committee will be reviewed at the summer meetings of the Management Council and President's Council for potential sponsorship of 2021 NCAA convention legislation. As approved by the NCAA Board of Governors at their April 2020 meeting, it is the expectation for all three divisions to be voting on a legislative slate at the 2021 convention. With that, I want to thank you for your time and participation of listening to this presentation. We do encourage you to take the survey that accompanies this presentation. It should take no longer than 10 minutes, and that feedback will be very helpful to the Legislation Committee as it endeavors to come to a positive recommendation for the best of the division. Thanks so much and have a great day.